President of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, who you also heard from yesterday. Thomas Greminger, Executive Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Velina Chakorova, geopolitical strategist and founder of Face for a Conscious Experience. And Ivan Krastev, Chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies and Albert Hirschman Permanent Fellow of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. The discussion will be moderated by Márton Ugrosti, Deputy State Secretary in charge of the Office of the Prime Minister's Political Director. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guests to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, good morning. Welcome to the third edition of the Budapest Global Dialogue. I would skip the introductions because most of these people next to me are very well known, and if you by any chance don't know them, just Google the conference program and you will find all the necessary information. What we're trying to disentangle here on stage today is that why the previous world order went wrong and what comes up next. And this is obviously one of the most complicated questions of our time. So just to make the most out of this 1 hour that we have today, let me start with Gladen, who's also filling in as a Hungarian today, because some of the major issues we're facing is that what happened to the rules-based international order, whether something like the rules-based international order ever existed, and whether that rules-based international order was based on any kind of liberal principles that it claimed to have for about 35 years since the end of the Cold War. So Gladen, you go first.
You've started off with a very dangerous question, because whenever you ask a former professor a question about the rules-based international order, you're inviting a 45-minute answer, but I'll try to be brief, just to put down a couple of flags or suggest a couple of points. Well, I think, as I mentioned yesterday, that right now we're in a kind of interregnum in the global political order, not only from a geopolitical standpoint. It's not clear to everyone what's happening to the world order. I mean, we can have strong views about it, but if it's not clear to everyone, then there's no answer. And also, it's a kind of intellectual interregnum. Basically, the concepts that were used to understand the world order were built up in a certain way. And I think that story goes back to the end of the Cold War, and particularly to the intellectual arguments that were built on both sides of the Cold War. And so in the West, the tendency right after the end of the Cold War was to say that our ideas were the reason that we won. And there's a certain truth to that, because the ideas of freedom are very important and played a role in the strength of the West. But somehow we let that view go to our heads, or we let ourselves kind of fall in love with the image that we were projecting. And eventually that caused or provided the environment in which some bad decisions were made. It changed our focus such that bad decisions, or decisions which weren't made in a substantial national or real interest, those decisions were justified on the basis of their correspondence to this intellectual regime. And of course, having grown up in the United States, I see it from that perspective, and I know that the experience of this order was different in every country and different in Europe as well. In the United States, it went from being an industrial powerhouse to a country which in the last few years has discovered that it was dependent upon many of its rivals for critical components even in its defense manufacturing processes. So this was a kind of accident that came about. It's hard to blame anyone, to pin the blame on any one thing in particular, but that's one example of a problem which we're now trying to reckon with. At a certain point in the 1990s and early 2000s, people thought, well, it doesn't really matter where things are made. So if these little components are cheaper to get from somewhere else, then all the better. Global prosperity is net increasing. They had like global happiness studies. At one point at Harvard, the happiness course, like the psychology of happiness, was the biggest course with 1,000 people, and you had very sophisticated charts about how net global happiness is increasing. and all this kind of absurdity. And so now we're facing a reckoning with the consequences of that. And just to make one final comment, right now the discourse is dominated by this kind of bipolar intellectual structure. Either we have the rules-based international order. This is the argument that's still made by the existing liberal classes, or outside of that, there is weeping, gnashing of teeth, and a raw power struggle that's very similar to Hobbesian intergovernmental state of nature, something like that. And so according to the rules-based international order crowd, the only way that we will obtain a workable international situation is by going back to and subscribing to the same rules, or recreating those, as Mark Harney said, among smaller groups of states. But instead, maybe there is a third alternative. We don't know exactly what it looks like, but it seems to me that unless and until states are able to articulate their own interests, identify their real strengths, seek to resolve weaknesses where they are weak, and come to a realistic assessment of their situation, unless and until that point is reached, we likely will enter an area of greater chaos. But the main point that I'm trying to make is that I think this bipolar intellectual structure, where it's either the old order or there's something that's completely chaotic, and this is used to kind of bully us into one way of thinking, I think that is a structure that's rapidly falling apart.
Ivan, I would like to turn to you because you've been looking at both the rules-based and the liberal components of the world order that existed up until the very recent times. Was it truly so, or were we just required to believe that there is something like the rules-based order? Because if someone looked at the history of the last 35 years, you might also quote Orwell, who said that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, which was clearly the case when it comes to global politics. And if you could also focus a little on how this touches upon Europe as an entity, that would be, I think, very enlightening.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Is there or not liberal order very much depended where you sit. And from this point of view, for sure, there was rules and there was double standards. This was there. But on the other side, this was an opening. That the economies, there was an opening of the world, and it was a reality. What happened in Davos, and for me this is particularly important, was that there was two consensuses, and in my view, two things that probably should make us also slightly more nervous than even we are. The first was, I do believe Carney made the most important statement was, this is a rupture. This is not a transition. So we see the crisis, but it does not mean that basically we have the vision of the next world order coming. And from this point of view, if you see both President Trump and Prime Minister Carney, they're going to work on, agreed on two things. Liberal order, even if it does not exist, it's not here anymore. So from this point of view on this, there was an agreement. Secondly, by the way, for both of them, the West is not an actor in any of the next orders. President Trump was speaking about the United States as the United States, and Mr. Carney very much adopted the perspective of a non-Western middle powers. When he talked about basically the hypocrisy of the international order, this was the major criticism coming from countries like India or Brazil or others. I'm saying this because both of them believe that part of the problem of the international liberal order was that it was hypocritical. But they were seeing two different ideas of why it was hypocritical. For Carney, it was hypocritical because we pretend that all countries were equal, but they were not. For President Trump, the major hypocrisy is to claim that states are equal. His major story was there are strong states and there are weak states, and they are not equal. So from this point of view, the very claim that they are equal is the biggest hypocrisy of it all. I'm saying this because as a result of it and listening to this debate, I don't believe that the vision of the President Trump is going to work, and unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic of what Mark Carney is suggesting. President Trump's doctrine, and I try to summarize, is very much the Agamemnon doctrines. It's not about sphere of influence. It's about that you have The major story of the United States is not that the United States is better than others, but the United States is stronger than others. So American exceptionalism is based on the exceptionalism of the American power. So as a result of it, in the spheres of influence, you basically believe that all great powers has a sphere of influence. From the President Trump's perspective, in the way Agamemnon can basically take Achilles' slave, the United States basically have more powers than other great powers. And the biggest story from this point of view is to what extent it's true. To what extent countries like India, countries like China and others are going to allow this to happen. And to be honest, this is not sure. Because if you're listening to the President Trump when it comes domestically, part of his kind of anger with the liberal order was that the America is much weaker than it pretended to be. So paradoxically, on one level, President Trump's position is based on the exceptional power of the United States. On the other side, Trumpian revolution very much is rooted in the fear that America basically is declining power. And I'm saying this because this is a real story, and we are going to face it. The minister said that it is a nationalistic revolution in the world. It's true, but be sure that in the nationalistic revolutions, there are going to be a clash of nationalisms. And it was very clear during the Greenland story. In a certain way, the problem of sovereignty is that different nationalisms are going to affirm themselves, particularly in a much more democratic age in which people are running. And Prime Minister Carney also, when he talks about the middle powers sustaining a much more integrated world, it's also not going to be easy to happen. Because the middle powers has different interests, they're very competitive, they go in a different way, and also negotiating this common interest takes a long time. And one of the things that, in my view, has changed dramatically in the world is the speed. Listen, we're like people who have been taken from a slower train to a fast train. And in 1990s, we have the illusion that we know the direction. Now the direction doesn't matter, what matters is the speed. And I'm saying this because as a result of it, we are going to be prepared for, in my view, at least a decade of disorder. And the real story is how small countries and mid-sized countries are going to deal with this. And for Europe, this is a major question. I'm listening to foreign ministers saying how well Hungary did and how badly the European Union is doing. Some of his criticism is legitimate, but to be absolutely honest, part of the strengths of Hungary was that it was part of the European Union. It was the veto of the European Union that allowed Hungary basically to part some of the role that it was playing. I don't want to be small Hungary in a world in which basically middle powers compete. And from this point of view, the real story is about what is it going to be possible for the European Union to be reconsolidated as an autonomous sovereign power in a world which is very different. I very much agree with the world that we have been talking about, and we are not going to be back to this world. From this point of view, we don't know what's going to happen. We know what will not happen. And this is going to be an interesting question, and by the way, it's very much an open question. But European Union, in order to be a player, means that there's going to be a much more integration on the level of particularly economies. There's going to be a much more need for a certain type of defense capabilities, which Europe didn't have before. And also it means a totally different relations with everybody, with the United States, with Russia, others. And listening to the panel yesterday, listen, sovereignty means also that even the nationalistic governments in Europe are going to ask the questions, how much power you're going to allow to the American technology companies to interfere in your domestic politics. So I do believe we're going to go for a ride, and I really believe that Carney is right. It's a rupture, it's not a transition.
I mean, that speed is certainly an issue because we're not really used to making quick decisions in any of these countries. Valina, one of your main focus of your research has been whether the world's going to become more bipolar with Russia and China on one corner and maybe everybody else on the other, or whether it's going to be something different. And if I come back to what Ivan just said about the role of the European Union, whether it will have any role at all, whether it should have any role at all, I think obviously how this new global setup takes shape is crucially important.
Thank you for having me at this highly interesting panel discussion. Now I will start from where my colleagues stopped because they have already provided a lot of talking points. And your question entails two different dimensions of an answer. First, of course, related to a new phenomenon in the international relations, one that basically no one predicted, no one foresaw happening. That is the modus operandi of strategic coordination between China and Russia, meanwhile in all systemically relevant domains. And if somebody had said that 10 years ago, like I did, the person will have been more or less coined quite idealistic about certain geopolitical developments because, as we all know, China and Russia are natural rivals. They have never been close in the bilateral relationship as they are right now in 2026. So this is a new reality, and this reality is one structure of many that is actually affecting the global system and is also having an impact on all three dimensions of international relations that are relevant right now. The one being hard power in a sense of not just use but also threat, and also the statecraft behind hard power, because you not always need to use hard power for the sake of national interest. You can just extrapolate or use the function of it, as we've seen in some cases with the threat of use of hard power. The second dimension being the geoeconomics, which is the statecraft applied to, again, national interests in the field of trade, in the field of economy. We have a full plethora of, meanwhile, of measures by states, and by the way, not only actually states like, like United States right now when it comes to Russia, for instance, but also the European Union as a middle power is using this geoeconomic statecraft to bring about certain outcomes. And the third dimension, of course, is technology, because we are in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. The winner takes all. This is the mindset. We have two front runners, everyone else. That means also middle powers such as the European Union are actually lagging behind, and either they will be joining one of the front runners or they will have to come up with a third solution. We don't know yet. We are in the middle of it. So it's a full swing of three different dimensions simultaneously happening. So the response by China and Russia right now is that they have to stick together, because by sticking together, they reduce the threat to domestic instability and chaos. So they want to actually prevent the chaos from outside, the volatility from outside entering their space. Think of the military purchase happening in China. This is a clear example, but also because of the overlapping interests, and this is the second dimension of this dragon bear. Why is it so actually efficient without the necessity of entering any strategic alliance, without the need to enter a military pact? They haven't signed really, I mean, they have signed, of course, joint declarations, and they have an agreement which is now 25 years plus old. But the reality of this modus operandi is that it's actually happening through organic top-down coordination, meanwhile in all relevant levels. And the second main factor why it's still strong, and it's getting stronger, is of course their common approach to this, what Ivan actually outlined, Pax Americana. The United States have a mindset that they cannot allow any other strategic or systemic rival to emerge on the global arena, that they will be the only power that will write and underwrite and impose the new rules of the game. That is the mindset of the Americans while entering this new phase of the international relations, and the Chinese and the Russians want this to prevent this. So to go back to the question, it's not a rupture, it's not a fracture. We are not there yet. We are still very much intertwined. The Chinese and the Russians are coordinating to reshape, to change certain realities, of course, for the sake of their interests. When it comes to the Europeans, now we are in a very awkward position. Our main strategic ally is fully entering all these arenas of competition with the mindset to win. And we haven't developed a mindset to win. We don't know actually what winning means. If you ask this question to every European capital and to Brussels, they have different answers to what winning means. Winning with whom? Who are our partners? Who are our allies? Who are our rivals? Who are our competitors? So in that sense, I think that Europe is currently sitting between two geopolitical chairs, but also two geoeconomic chairs. And on the side of technology, I also don't see the answers. Yeah, I agree, of course, no technological supremacy should be allowed to interfere with the own sovereignty, but at the same time, what's the answer to that? What's the alternative? So the point here is that there hasn't been an answer to the dragon bear phenomenon. In fact, Russia would have never started a war of that scale without the sustained long-term oriented support by China. And China now in 2025 clearly said it's not in our interest for Russia to lose the war against Ukraine. So what are the Europeans doing about it? And I think that this is a clear sign that we are now in the next phase of these international relations. And what's the next phase? It's managed confrontation. We cannot allow this system to enter into a stage of a full-scale abyss, full-scale collapse. Nobody wants a collapse. So the dragon bear is still cooperating. The Chinese are cooperating with the Americans. The Russians are now talking to the Americans. Everyone is talking to everyone. And I think that for the middle powers, it's going to be much more difficult to navigate these formats of talking because, yes, behind the talking, there is a lot of action happening. So you need to also provide the backing to the talking. So first, define the agenda of talking. I think this is for Europe the absolute must in 2026. And second, bring about the actions that will actually back this talking. And this is what the Chinese and the Russians are doing in 2026 in all fields, from commodities and energy to trade and economy to technological cooperation, dual use, transfer to security, defense, and space coordination.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive overview. What really strikes me in these conversations that everybody talks about how the previous system is unraveling and there's something new coming up. But even if we talk about multipolarity, we end up with discussing the West and the dragon bear on the other hand, which are basically two poles. So enter India. I think India has arrived to this juncture a little bit earlier with the India First policy and Prime Minister Modi's new ideas and new posture of Indian foreign policy about 10 years ago. But still what we see is that most of the discussion is centered on these two major poles. I also think because of laziness, if I can put it that way, because we got used to the bipolar setting for more than 40 years, even 80. So it's very convenient to go back to these schemes. How you can break that up and how you can navigate between these two poles, especially if you want to become a pole on its own right.
Thank you, and Jorgel Kivanok, and it's really good to be back here in Budapest. Look, there's not a lot to add. We heard a lot last night, yesterday evening, this morning from the Hungarian Foreign Minister and from my co-panelists already, and there's a lot to agree with in what they say. But I think, just taking a step back, international orders come and go. Right? There's still a lot of nostalgia for an old international order, particularly in Europe. I see that a lot. In India, we don't necessarily share that nostalgia for the post-World War II international order. It was a difficult time for India. But I mean, just to put in some context, the room we're in dates from 1896. There have been 5 international orders, at least, that have come and gone since this was built, right? This was a decade after the Berlin Conference, which carved up Africa. This was the heyday of the colonial sort of international order. We had then sort of World War I, we had an interregnum, a brief interwar international order. We had arms control treaties from that time, which people forget about now. And then World War II, obviously the Cold War. The fact that we can't even come up with a single name for what followed the Cold War is quite telling. And perhaps historians of the near future will delve into that. We'll have a consensus. But whether you call it the post-Cold War order, the rules-based international order, the liberal international order, somewhat reveals one's approach or one's attitude towards that. The one thing I think that all of these international orders have, which we sometimes skirt around, is they all required either a hegemon to enforce that international order, which actually Carney in some ways referred to in his Davos speech. In some ways, there was always a double standard because you had a hegemon. Or it required a concert. That is, the great powers had to come together and figure out some broad rules of engagement for the international order, which is what happened in Vienna in 1815, it's what happened in Berlin, and it's what happened in San Francisco after World War II. So, neither of those things is going to happen soon. We don't have a hegemon, or at least a country that is willing, wanting to behave like a hegemon right now, nor do we have a concert of major powers that are willing to come together and change the rules. We can go over all the reasons why that post-Cold War international order came to an end. Elites versus populism, immigration, inequality, COVID, conflicts. But in some ways, another breaking point that hasn't, again, been mentioned much so far is the collective realization of overdependence. That every country was overdependent on others for something, whether it was for energy, whether it was for security, again, particularly relevant in the context of Europe, less so in Asia or the Indo-Pacific, whether it was for immigration, and whether it was for the means of production. And that's something that even implicated the United States as well. So we have this, I think, again, we can all sit and diagnose the problem. But the question I think everyone is contending with, even though we recognize this problem, is that everyone is in some ways overdependent on the United States for markets, for technology, and at least for Europe for security, and overdependent on China for the means of production. So again, we're reverting in some ways to a world where there's stronger emphasis on sovereignty, on hedging, where everyone is seeking multiple partners and multiple options, seeking new markets, but struggling again sometimes to reshore or bring home domestic production. I would just sort of end on the idea, again, not rocket science. I'm a little more skeptical that this interregnum than Gladden was. I think that this interregnum will last for the foreseeable future. Because I think things are coming to a head, and I'll give you why. One is, I think there are just geopolitical contests underway, three major ones that I will briefly mention. And the resolution or the conclusion of these, whether they are active conflicts or peacetime security competition, will have a profound impact on shaping whatever emerges out of this. So whatever the conclusion of the Ukraine war looks like will have, again, whatever you may think about it, will have implications for Europe and for Russia directly, and for others indirectly. Whatever happens in the Middle East, where you have multiple, quite powerful, quite potent and independent actors, as well as major powers involved in various ways, is going to have implications for the future international order. And whatever happens in the Indo-Pacific, which is turning into a much more zero-sum competition between the US and China, even if we may have over the next 12 months an attempt to engage by the Trump administration to engage with Beijing. Whatever the outcome there will also have a very significant effect on China's ability to play a major role in the international system, or the United States continuing a role. But there's a fourth factor as well, in addition to these theaters of geopolitical competition, which is technology. And in certain key emerging technologies, right now it's about AI in particular, the focus is on AI, but it is beyond that in some ways. It's going to be much harder to hedge. It is going to be very difficult for countries to say, I want to borrow a piece of this from here and this from here and integrate it all together without it having a security, sort of domestic and very deep economic and security impact. And so again, we're moving from a clash of civilizations, if you will, to a clash of automations. This is going to happen. And so I think some of these decisions are going to have to be made even starting now, and maybe they already have. There is a certain path dependency that is going to bring to an end this interregnum much sooner than we think. And so if we're having this conversation a decade from now, I don't think we will be throwing our hands up and gnashing our teeth about the end of the old order. We will be discussing something very different and very new.
It always fascinates me that how we always get back to the idea and the threat of uncertainty when it comes to international relations and inability to predict what's going to happen. And I absolutely agree with you that technology is a dimension that we often overlook because everybody is focused on hard power, number of ships, everything else, which we know. And technology is moving at so quickly, it's really hard to keep track of. Thomas, I turn to you finally in the first round. We tend to say that in Europe and also for smaller countries, the margin of error is really low when it comes to understanding the new system, which is coming and finding our place within that. And Switzerland has for a very long time been very successful in navigating this uncharted territory. But I wonder if this new setup which is emerging is still something that small nations can understand and influence on the other hand as well. Because if you want to shape the world in a way which benefits you, you obviously have to take a stake in that. And you also have to take responsibility for what's coming up next. And I think one of the major questions about sovereignty is that if you make sovereign decisions, you are responsible for those sovereign decisions, whether they're good or bad. And this is also, I think, part of the reasons that frustration with you is growing, because occasionally the responsibility part goes missing.
Well, thanks, Martin. Thanks for having me here in Budapest. And I will be pleased to say a few words about the potential of middle powers, and I would consider the country that I come from as a middle power, even though we Swiss would define ourselves as a small state. But I think when we look at the characteristics of our foreign and security policies, it is very much the one of a middle power. And I do share Mark Carney's assessment of the potential of middle powers in reshaping the world order, provided they act, they cooperate more systematically and more collectively. But let me first say something about this old order, or the previous order that has been referred to here last night and this morning. I'm not fundamentally contesting that there is a rupture in the world order and that we face the challenge of amending the order. But I would also at the same time remind ourselves that the world order we knew has left us with gains that will not be lost. There is still a vast majority of states that believe in the international rule of law. Despite of great powers changing borders by military means, by threatening military force on an ally, by conducting very assertive foreign policies, the vast majority still believes in international law. Second, the vast majority of states still believe that collective problems need collective solutions. And everybody needs to pitch in. So I think there is still a strong sense that there is a need for global cooperation. And I think, thirdly, a vast majority believes that the planet is closing in on us. We need to address climate change. We need to get our act together in producing global commons. And I think for this, we need to build these plurilateral alliances around the challenges that we face. And in that sense, I think we have to reform and strengthen the multilateral institutions, mechanisms, and I think simply relying on nationalism and national sovereignty will not do the job. Now, in all of this, I think middle powers have an important role to play. Now, let me perhaps say a couple of things of what makes a middle power. Obviously, you could kind of, start out with everybody that is caught in between the three hegemons is a middle power, but I think that's not very practical. So, in my sense, there is a material capacity, how you use and project power and exert leverage. there is a willingness, a political commitment to lead on specific issues, to be a bridge builder, to be a peacemaker, to be a multilateral reformer. And then obviously, middle powers' role is very much relational. They operate they have to maneuver in a space between great powers and small ones. And I alluded to it, it's also, to an extent, a matter of self-definition. So, for instance, I ask myself, does Hungary consider itself as a middle power? I'm not sure. As I said, the country that I'm coming from has this self-identification with a small state, just like, for instance, Qatar has, Norway, Singapore. But then if you look at these countries' behavior, it's clearly a middle power behavior. Then I think while it's important that these countries are super agile, they also need to be predictable and reliable. I think a solid reputation is absolutely key for middle powers agency. So you cannot be totally transactional, while flexible, in choosing your alliances, but there needs to be, you need to stick to a series of principles. And perhaps finally, what I think is important for a middle power, it's the political commitment, I said, to act and to shape international relations, but this needs to be combined with diplomatic tradecraft. I mean, you need politicians that are ready to invest political capital, but if this is not followed up by diplomatic expertise, I think the result won't be very compelling. So now what can these middle powers do? Well, obviously they have a vested interest in a predictable system that is defined by rule of law. Middle powers, they are very vulnerable in an anarchic, chaotic system, and I think they can, as I said, that they need to act collectively and cooperatively, and I think they can, be engines of reform when it comes to European security, when it comes to reforming the UN, when it comes to producing global commons. And, when I listened to Mark Carney in Davos, I felt, well, it's great, that we are now rediscovering this notion of middle powers. It's not that they haven't played an important role. 50 years ago, the Helsinki process was very much driven by what we then called the N+N, the neutral, non-aligned. Well, today we would probably call them a club of middle powers that, have allied themselves. Canada, Human Security Network, 25 years ago, they launched this network that was for like 5 to 8 years an extremely powerful driver of things, like the Ottawa Anti-Personal Mine Convention, dealing with child soldiers, creating the UN Human Rights Council. This was driven by 15, what we today would call middle powers. So to conclude, I think there is a potential by these countries to stabilize, to shape, and to reform the international order by, using flexible, adaptive coalitions. And I think in order to be effective, they need a combination of political commitment, diplomatic skills, and a reputational capital.
Thank you. Glenn and I saw you wanted to jump in, but before we go there, what keeps bothering me throughout this conversation is that everybody talks about the need of a new order, new cooperation, no zero-sum games, and so on and so forth. But in order to have that, you need to have a minimum set of principles on which everybody agrees on. And I don't see that consensus emerging for now. And we talk about sovereignty, we talk about economic statecraft, we talk about might makes right, we talk about multipolarity, all those kind of things, but we do seem to miss a final, not a final, but a common understanding of where we stand and what we are trying to achieve. And Thomas, you talked about global commons, global warming and these issues, which are obviously unresolvable on a state level. But if you're not inclined to cooperate because you have a general mistrust against the other, you're obviously not going to solve these problems either. So Glenn and I will come to you next, but could you please also reflect on what these principles could be? Because it also came across to me throughout these interventions that we still value order above chaos. And we still want to have some predictability for the future just in order to minimize the risks which all of us have to face.
I'm thinking in the same direction as you now, but instead of answering on the level of principles, I think I would answer by asking what are the current agents in what we're calling the international order. And I think maybe we're talking too much about global order, and it's a risk of conferences like this. Maybe we're talking too much about global order and not enough about defining who the political agents are. One thing that happened, I think, during the construction of the post-Cold War world order, and I think it's something which makes it distinct from most of the other recent international orders, is that it very quickly dispensed with the nation. And I know that this is a common trope at these conferences, and maybe this one in particular. But I remember when NAFTA and GATT were approved, I remember the major trade deals of the 1990s. And in the US, each and every one was sold to American voters as being in their national interest. Even though maybe the statisticians at Harvard or wherever were thinking about global happiness optimization. But that was not the case with the introduction of these things. And nevertheless, that was quickly left behind. So the dynamic was we're going to sell NAFTA and a free trade zone to the American voters, and we're going to build a bridge to the 21st century, as President Clinton said, through the tech bubble and switching to a services-based economy. That's the path to the future. No one made the argument that's the path to breaking middle America and ruining the Midwest and destroying industrial towns. No one said that because no one would have voted for it. They said, this is the path to a rational future, which will be better for you. It will be better for you if Walmart replaces all the mom and pop stores because it's better. Why should we sit around making things when we can just buy them cheaply on credit from foreign sources? And then when it didn't work out that way, the very people who were sold on this stuff on the basis of their national interest were accused of being nationalists in a bad way. And so that perspective has been lost. Now, when we come to talking about the forthcoming or future international order, there's understandable apprehension. I think I've seen maybe 5 or 10 articles with some variation of we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, we can't leave behind international law, leave behind international norms. And there's an element of truth to that. Maybe the world of international law became too overgrown, but if we accept that there's a jus gentium or a right among nations, for example, that if we accept that there is a principle of just war and that there are unjust wars, then the question is what framework is going to secure them the best? This is also, leading back to this agent question, this is also the question in Europe. From the Brussels perspective, an ever closer union that is more economically rational is more rational. That will be better for everyone. But when the what I would call the natural political agent is left behind, when the actor that really functions in the international space is forgotten, ultimately worse decisions are made. So what is the situation there? I think many nations of different sizes are facing the reality that what they thought was going to be a source of their strength, like they joined the international order because it was sold as being beneficial to them. Many have recognized that it wasn't, and they have to evaluate and return to their sources of strength. That will be different for every country. It's based also on tradition and history, and there's a kind of path dependency to it. Switzerland, for example, has a very unique role in the international stage, so we can't just, compare two countries of the same size and kind of similar location and conclude that they act in the same way. Hungary will have a different role. Same for the other countries in Europe. To make one provocation then, I think where we're headed is to basically a clash of the Board of Peace and BRICS. So right now the situation is that BRICS has begun to articulate itself in recent years as a flexible, multipolar, ad hoc multilateralism, something like that. You take all the words and kind of stir them up. But we've got the liberal international order and the remains of it on one side, and then this different set of ad hoc arrangements on the other. And I think what Trump is doing with the Board of Peace is proposing something kind of like that, but on the Western side. It involves many of the same countries that are involved in BRICS. It does not involve many European countries, with a couple of exceptions. It depends upon, say what you will about it, it's easy for one to roll one's eyes at these new constructions which are coming up, but it's trying to be based more clearly on national interests, where the leaders who are involved are making ad hoc agreements, and it may encroach upon the dragon bearer. It may encroach upon certain countries that are closer to the BRICS world. So maybe that's where the clash lies, or not the clash, but maybe that's where the contest lies. There are, nations have their own interests. There are goods in the international space that many of them agree upon. There can be ad hoc agreements about water, energy, nuclear cooperation, trading zones, and maybe it'll be more overlapping. But I think, it was early in the Trump administration. I think even Secretary Rubio said, well, it's clearly entering a more multipolar era, but from the U.S. perspective, not the one that's articulated by the BRICS powers. When the Russians talk about multipolarity, they were making an argument against the Western system. So again, I think that's maybe a hazy area, but I think that's where this logic is going to take us.
Ivan, the principles are one of the questions, but the other is, coming back to what you said on the European Union, is that whether we can define the European interest as the sum of the national interests of European countries, or whether there's a separate set of European interests on which we might have to find some common understanding in order to be more successful in the years to come.
Thank you very much. And to be honest, I am slightly less enthusiastic about Board of Peace. For me, it always looks like a private golf club in which you go with a billion contribution. But I'm saying this because for the European Union, it cannot be taken for granted that in this order is going to act as an actor. European Union can become an actor, can become a middle power, it can fragment. And this is also quite clear, because the problem is if we're going in economic terms to also move to a space which is much more protectionist, what is the size that you can protect? Can Bulgaria go protectionist? What is the economy that you're going to protect exactly? So from this point of view, the size matters in this world which we're talking about. And for the European Union is how to be an actor in this world. And this is not an ideological question, it's about the problem, can we be such an actor? And here many things are going to be not easy. Because countries and Europeans, we can have common dreams, but our nightmares are very national. For example, when the foreign minister said the war between Russia and Ukraine is not Europe's war, it sounds in one thing in Budapest, but try to say this in Tallinn or in Warsaw. And I want to hear how the Polish nationalists and how the Estonian nationalists are going to react to this. So from this point of view, Europeans who should decide. And because Europe is going to decide, in order to be an actor, Europe is going to reinvent itself. I do believe European Union in the way we know it is not going to be there. But there are going to be probably a much more closer cooperation between countries that believe that for them European Union matters. And they're going to go closer on the level of the capital market, on the level of defense. So it's going to be much more coalition of the willings. Secondly, in European Union, every small country has a veto. And by the way, countries like Bulgaria and Hungary very much benefited from this. In the Board of Peace, you don't have a veto, you have a chairman for life. And I'm saying this because we're not kind of in the first year of school. We know that states are not equal. We know that in the world politics, Bulgaria is neither United States nor China, but the fiction of equality of states was very important for any order. The moment you start to believe that sovereignty is not a right, but a privilege, then we're in a totally different world. And this is why for Europe, in my view, this is the real question. How it is going to be solved very much depends also on the talent and the capabilities of the political leaders. It's going to depend on the electoral cycles and on the politicians. And at the end of the day, it's going to depend on crisis. And Europe, by the way, is in a much more difficult position to anybody else. But we're in a period in which identities are going to change. All the major powers are changing their identities. It's true for the United States, it's true for Russia, to a certain extent for China. For sure it's going to be true for the European Union, but also it's true for major companies. Do you remember that 10 years ago we were saying the multinational companies do not have national passports? Do anybody believe it anymore? So I do believe we're in a period of a kind of a major change of identities, and we are going to end not simply, and we cannot explain what is happening simply as a shift of power. We are going to come with a new world order which is going to be based on a different agents.
Velina, you mentioned the rule of law, which is obviously can interpret it as a certain set of behaviors which lower the cost of being mistaken and making mistakes and making the behavior of the other party more predictable, or whether this is something which is based on what has been called values for the last 35 years, which is a very specific set of ideas characteristic of a certain part of the world and not necessarily the rest. Which approach would serve the New World Order better?
Yeah, as someone who is a practitioner in the field of geopolitics, the most hated question is actually the question about values, because I operate exactly in the field where I see state and non-state actors exercising the use of hard power whenever an interest is affected. So even if we take the values-based approach into consideration from, let's say, the last 30 years, let's just focus on the last 30 years shortly. Again, my claim is that the values-based approach coming from the so-called West was only and solely possible because of the hard power projection of one state actor who enabled this global power projection following the collapse of the Soviet Union and following actually the victory over the other superpower. So we have necessary condition, and then we have a sufficient condition. And of course, the values that followed were values derived from a Western coalition from the coalition of the free world. And I argue that once again, values will be redefined, but they will be redefined in different levels. One level will be, of course, the level of the system level, the triumvirate of great powers. There, of course, they will be projecting values inwards and outwards. But clearly, if you take a look at the Dragon Bear, this is an anti-Western, it's not non-Western, it's anti-Western coalition. So they have values. And when they come together with other partners around the globe, for instance, in the Global South, in different mini-laterals, they project values that are non-Western, and it's their right to do so. So they package this, of course, not only with hard power and not only with military cooperation, but they package this also with diplomacy, with soft power-based cooperation, and so on and so forth. And that's their right. They have their own reading and understanding of the international order. And by the way, it's very important also to understand they do not want to destroy this international order. They actually want to underwrite it. They want to reshape it. They want to disrupt it and build it from within, which is a very important differentiation. Then, when we talk about the middle powers or the swing states or the king makers in various power equilibriums. Power is, meanwhile, as I said, not just about military strength and security related issues. Most of the issues that we will be dealing with in the next 10, 15 years will be non-security related issues. Now, these middle powers are not necessarily anti-Western. They are mostly non-Western. They have a mindset, actually, that's related to their own needs, to their own interests, and very often they are again, navigating between these two centers of powers, between these two different blocks radiating different values. Now, I argue that once again, if there would be a Pax Americana 2.0, because we don't know for a fact whether the United States will win this new competition, again, we are in a systemic competition. It's all-win competition in all terrains simultaneously, and the mindset coming from China and United States, and Russia by extension, because Russia took a side long before making the decision on Ukraine. There the things are clear. So here the question, of course, is what kind of values will the United States be projecting to the world, to its partners, to the new free world coalition, because there will be one, probably with reshaped values, not the values that we know from the last liberal, rules-based order, but there will be values linked to it. Will it be the freedom? Will it be the ideological part? Again, a communist party is in charge when it comes to the systemic competition, but we don't know for a fact, but this will be decisive this time. And I argue that the part that we are now underestimating is actually the one related to the role of the non-Western bloc of countries, because this is not going to be a non-aligned bloc this time. These are countries with ambitions, these are countries with significant geoeconomic and geopolitical leverage. These are countries that can combine the strengths and their interests in different formats. We are seeing this clearly. I think this is what Carney was alluding to, basically realizing that Canada is now on this meta level of interactions, and they will be defining their own values through their engagement. They will be finding common denominators. But maybe a last point, I think there is one common value that I extract from this dire stage of the international relations, and that is that there is zero interest on behalf of all these competitors to engage in a direct hot confrontation, in a direct hot war. The rationale to prevent conventional and nuclear confrontation against each other, I think this in itself is the value that we need to cherish and we need to build on, and we need to, use as a stabilizer for the next phase of the international relations.
Well, let's hope that this part will become true at the end, that we're not going to enter a hot war with any of the major powers. Dhruva, conscious of time, just a very quick question. Obviously, if you want to become a major power in this new setup, that comes with a cost. Part of that is soft power, part of that are the values that you stand for, part of that is the image that you radiate, part of that is how you're trying to attract these countries that Velina was alluding to. How you can make this happen with a country which has a democratic background, so you have the disadvantage of having to have elections from time to time, which brings certain uncertainty into the mix.
No, of course. I mean, there are lots of challenges. I would defer, I think, with this idea that the choices between the Board of Peace and BRICS, because one is I don't think BRICS has a common agenda on a lot of things. The one commonality that the BRICS countries have is that emphasis on sovereignty. So in some ways it's almost and again, the areas that each country in BRICS emphasizes is different. We actually have some BRICS members who have joined the Board of Peace as well. So I'm not sure that that's look, any international order I think there are three ways of looking at it. There's the governance of the global commons, and that is something we're already seeing breaking. I mean, arguably space and cyberspace are no longer global commons. They're becoming sovereign, they're becoming territorialized. The Arctic is, it's only a matter of time before other aspects of the global commons break in that way. Second is the rules of engagement for economic commerce, economic transactions across borders. And this is something I think we started taking for granted. We thought this was going to be something that would override. I remember all those books and articles about, you know, this is going to be the future, the sovereign state's no longer going to matter. But the fact is, I think that is now being dialed back. And so I think all of that we're realizing rests on the security order. And until that is resolved, the rest of it, I think, will all flow from that, right? Which gets into, I think, 4 very interesting debates that are taking place internally in 4 regions. I'd say in Asia, we have the clearest idea what that debate is, which is, are countries comfortable with a Sino-centric order or not? And that Sino-centric order is a manifestation of the Chinese Communist Party, right? So actually, I think Edward Luttwak is here. He has, I think, the best description of what that is, some slightly provocative description. But I think that is the internal debate. And what we're seeing, for example, in elections in Japan right now, is the Japanese public resoundingly saying, we are not comfortable with that Sino-centric world order. And it's playing out differently in different capitals. The second one, I think, is in the Middle East. Are we going to go in a direction of a more progressive Middle East or more conservative? And in some ways, the litmus test is that the recognition of Israel is in some ways a bit of a litmus test to that. So that is what happens in Iran is going to affect that. The third debate is a European debate, which we're part of. Ivan actually just very nicely captured what the essence of that is. And the fourth one, the one that I think is the most uncertain that we're all watching, is the debate in the United States. And even within the Republican Party, there is a debate because there's not a common idea of what those values are that they stand for. Is the future a realm of influence future? Trump would like to see maybe a new Yalta, right? Is that good? Is that something? But not everyone in his party agrees with that view, right? Is it a more recessed United States? Is it an alternative international order? I mean, remember, only 17% of Americans right now back MAGA or associate themselves with MAGA so it's not the, and so I think we're having a very schizophrenic debate in the United States. And these will all affect the question of values. India has its own internal debate, has its own role. I would just say the one thing, coming back to what I said in my opening remarks on technology, what India is trying to advance on the technological front, we're going to see this in the next few weeks in the AI summit that India hosts, is something very different from what the US or China or even Europe is advancing, which is an open system, what we call digital public infrastructure. And that, I think, is what we're going to see in the technological realm. We're going to see aspects of that in other areas as well. So if you want to know, like, what is India's values in an international order, I would point you to that.
Last word goes to Thomas. Most of the countries of the world are not great powers and not even middle powers. So in this new setup, do the weak have to suffer what they must, or is there another way out?
Pardon? I didn't get your question.
Yeah, most of the countries of the world are not great powers and not even middle powers. So do the weak have to suffer what they must, or is there another way for them to survive?
Well, that's why they have to team up, and that's why they have to act much more systematically in a collective way in order not to basically be trampled upon by the 3 hegemons. And I think this is not going to happen automatically. I think you need, again, you need political leadership to create these different alliances and to make them effective. But I think the potential is there, and as Mark Carney said, I mean, you sit at the table or you're on the menu, and I think I agree with that. But just on the value thing, I think this is a very important point. I would also clearly subscribe to this idea that if you want to build trust and confidence among states, I think this basically starts at home. And I think it starts with strengthening trust and the interest that people take in each other, people across different socioeconomic circumstances, and it starts with hopes and fears of people. And I think social cohesion is going to be a very important value or principle when we kind of re-amend or reshape a new world order. And finally, I also, wouldn't totally agree with this binary choice, Board of Peace versus BRICS. My reading of BRICS is very much a gathering of states that would not want to replace the international system, but would want to reform it to make it more supportive of their interests. And that is obviously valid for the Bretton Woods institutions, it's valid for the UN, it's valid for the UN Security Council. The Board of Peace, again, I think more than half of those that have joined it still see it as a body to see through the Gaza peace plan. And I think they're right in joining this body, because in any peace process, you always need a group of political stakeholders that drive the process. Then underneath, you need, the technical expertise, you need the diplomats, the experts, that, make things happen on the ground. But above, you need a body that sees it through. And I think in that sense, the Board of Peace for Gaza, I think I'm fine with. The Board of Peace for other conflicts around the globe, for Ukraine, etc., I think it's a very bad idea.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of this conversation this morning. I think we came back to the idea of sovereignty once again, that nations are responsible for themselves, and if there's one lesson that we can take home today is that we have to think harder, which is great news, because that means that we're going to have our jobs for the foreseeable future as well. Please join me in thanking the panel for this great conversation, and hope to continue that over the coffee break.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers for such an engaging opening session this morning. It's now time for a short break. We have some coffee, tea, and other refreshments waiting for you outside. Our program will continue after the break with a keynote address by North Macedonia's Minister of Digital Transformation at 11:10. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy the break.